On October 2nd, 1943, a covered army truck rolled into a detention camp on the flat edge of the Texas Panhandle. Inside were 37 Italian women, not nurses, not wives, not tourists lost in the war. They were prisoners, and 6 days later, the United States Army tried to welcome them with something the mess hall proudly called pizza. It was a square of biscuit dough, painted with ketchup, buried under orange cheese, and topped with sliced hot dogs. Lucia Bellomo stared at it. Then she did the one thing no prisoner was supposed to do in a room full of armed guards. She laughed, not softly, not politely. She laughed so hard every fork in the mess hall stopped moving. The guard in front of her said, "Mom, what's funny?" Lucia pointed at the tray and said, in careful English, "This is not pizza." Then she looked around at the proud American cooks. "This is a warning." For a few seconds, nobody knew whether to be offended. Then Private Caleb Rusk, a ranch boy from outside Amarillo, stood up from the guard's table with a grin he could not hide. He was 25, tall, sunburned, and more comfortable with cattle than paperwork. His uniform never looked fully convinced it belonged on him. He walked over, tapped the edge of Lucia's tray, and said, "You telling me the Army got Italy wrong?" Lucia looked him dead in the eye. "The Army has made many mistakes," she said. "This one has sauce." That was the first time anyone in Camp Granite Flats heard an Italian prisoner laugh. It would not be the last. But at the time, none of them understood what had just opened. Not the guards, not the women, not Lucia, because that ugly piece of army pizza would become the door through which a prison camp, a Texas town, and a group of women carrying the shame of a broken country would learn to see each other without uniforms first. But before any of that could happen, somebody had to admit the food was terrible. The camp itself had been built too quickly. Granite Flats was not on any postcard. It was a scatter of tar paper barracks, barbed wire, wooden watch platforms, and caliche dust that turned every boot white by noon. The wind never seemed to stop. It pushed grit through window cracks, under doors, into hair, teeth, blankets, and bread. The Army had built the place for men. German prisoners, mostly. Maybe Italian soldiers if transport orders changed. It had not been built for 37 Italian women who arrived after Italy's armistice had turned every category inside out. 3 weeks earlier, Italy had stopped fighting for the Axis and started stumbling toward the Allies. On paper, Italian captives were no longer enemies in the same way. In practice, nobody at Granite Flats knew what that meant. The women had served in auxiliary jobs. Typists, telephone operators, mess assistants, supply clerks. Some had volunteered. Some had been pushed by families, offices, party officials, or hunger. A few had worn the regime's symbols with pride. Most had worn whatever the war told them to wear. Now it's a Simp's problem with no clean label. Captain Warren Pike, who commanded the camp, had received 1 page of instructions and 4 pages of warnings. Keep them separated. Keep them accounted for. Do not mistreat them. Do not trust them too quickly. He read the order twice and looked out at the yard where the women were climbing down from the truck, squinting into the Texas sun. They did not look dangerous. They looked exhausted. Lucia Bellomo was 23. She came from a village outside Palermo, where the sea was always close enough to smell, even when you could not see it. She had grown up with olive trees, whitewashed walls, and a grandmother who believed bread dough could tell you whether a woman was patient, distracted, angry, or in love. Lucia had not seen the sea in months. At Granite Flats, the horizon was so flat it felt unfinished. There were no church bells, no narrow stone lanes, no blue water breaking the sky. Just dust, mesquite, laundry lines, and a radio somewhere playing fiddle music through static. The first days passed in a strange half-silence. The women were assigned bunks. They washed uniforms in metal tubs. They cleaned supply rooms. They stood for count in the mornings while guards mispronounced their names. But the Americans were not what Lucia expected. They were too casual. They asked questions. They said morning like the war could be set down for coffee. One guard wanted to know if all Italians sang opera. Another asked whether Rome had cowboys. Caleb Rusk asked Lucia what Sicily looked like, then listened to the answer as if she were describing another planet. Lucia did not trust that kindness. Kindness from captors could vanish quickly, so she kept her face polite and her heart folded shut. Until the sixth night, when the menu board announced Italian supper. The women lined up with cautious hope. Even bad pasta would have meant something. Even overcooked tomatoes. Even military beans with garlic. Then Lucia reached the serving counter. The cook, proud as a parade marshal, gave her the square slice of pizza. For 1 second, homesickness and insult collided so hard in her chest she could not breathe. The dough was too thick. The sauce was sweet. The cheese was wrong. The hot dogs were unforgivable. And somehow that made it funny. Not because the camp was harmless. Not because the war had become gentle. But because the United States Army, with its trucks and rifles and endless paperwork, had looked at Italy and produced a ketchup mattress. Lucia laughed. And when Caleb challenged her, something old and stubborn woke up in her. No, she told him. If you wish to feed Italian women, you must let Italian women near the kitchen. Caleb lifted an eyebrow. You want to cook for the camp? I want to rescue the camp, Lucia said. The cook behind the counter muttered that prisoners did not rescue supper, but Caleb was already turning toward Captain Pike. The captain listened with the face of a man who did not want one more complication. He had German prisoners to process, train schedules to answer, ration forms to sign, and headquarters demanding reports written in language no human being had ever spoken. But he also had 37 women eating just enough to stay alive. And he had a mess hall full of guards suddenly curious about whether they had been lied to by a menu board. So the next afternoon, Captain Pike gave Lucia and 5 other women 2 hours in the kitchen. 2 hours. 1 guard at the door. No knives except under supervision. No wandering. No nonsense. Lucia accepted the terms as if he had handed her the keys to Rome. The kitchen was not a kitchen by her grandmother's standards. It was a military engine, steel counters, giant pots, flour in sacks, canned tomatoes stacked like ammunition, blocks of cheese wrapped in wax, garlic in a mesh bag half forgotten near the potatoes, no fresh basil, no proper mozzarella, no wood-fired oven, no stone, no mercy. Lucia stood in the center of it, placed both hands on the flour sack, and smiled for the first time since capture. We can work, she said, and they did. Elena Sarti from Naples took charge of the sauce, crushing canned tomatoes with the seriousness of a surgeon. Mirella Conti, who had worked in a bakery before the war, mixed flour, water, yeast, and salt until the dough stopped looking like paste and started looking alive. Teresa Gallo found dried oregano and held it up like contraband treasure. Lucia kneaded. At first, the American cooks watched with folded arms. Then they watched with interest. Then they started asking questions. Why so much time for the dough? Why not dump the sauce straight from the can? Why did Elena smell the garlic before using it? Lucia answered some questions and ignored others. She was not there to teach yet. She was there to prove. Caleb stood by the door, officially guarding them. Unofficially, he was mesmerized. The women changed when their hands touched food. The guarded faces softened. Shoulders loosened. Italian filled the room in quick bursts, sharp arguments, jokes, corrections, memories. One woman began humming a street song from Bari, another joined in. Soon, the kitchen sounded less like a prison and more like a crowded family room just before Sunday dinner. Caleb had seen men fight to stay alive in North Africa. He had seen prisoners collapse from heat and fear. He had not seen anyone recover themselves through flour. He stepped closer. "What are you singing?" he asked. Lucia looked down at the dough. "A song about home." Then after a moment she added, "And about food. In Italy many songs become about food eventually." Caleb laughed. "Can I help?" The room went quiet enough for the stove to be heard. Lucia looked at him. "You?" "Yes, Mom." "You are guard." "Yes, Mom." "You have hands like fence posts." "Yes, Mom." A smile tugged at her mouth. "Fine, wash the fence posts." Caleb washed his hands, rolled up his sleeves, and became the first guard at Granite Flats to be ordered around by an Italian prisoner with flour on her cheek. His first dough to a lump, his second folded into his wrist. Lucerde clicked her tongue. "Gentle. You do not fight dough. I fight calves," Caleb said. "Then you must learn something smaller than a calf can still defeat you." By the time the first pans came from the oven, word had spread across the camp. Guards drifted in. Cooks leaned through the door. Captain Pike arrived, pretending he had come only to inspect safety rules. Lucia cut the first piece and handed it to Caleb. The crust was blistered at the edges, soft at the center, sharp with garlic, bright with tomato, and good enough to make the ugly room fall silent. Caleb took one bite. He stared at the piece in his hand. "Well," he said, "I owe Italy an apology. That sentence did what no order could have done." It made the women laugh again. Within a week, the kitchen privilege became a routine. Not official, not advertised, not written in any manual Captain Pike would have dared send to headquarters. But 3 afternoons a week, under guard, the Italian women cooked. They made pasta from ration flour and eggs traded from a nearby farm. They made soups from scraps the army cooks would have wasted. They stretched small luxuries until they looked generous. They taught the cooks that garlic should not be burned black, that pasta should not surrender, and that olive oil was not decoration. The Americans taught them Texas in return. Beans cooked low and slow, coffee strong enough to argue with, cornbread in cast iron, smoke from mesquite wood, the difference between a steer, a bull, and a calf, which Caleb insisted was important, and Lucia insisted was only important to people trapped in Texas. For a few weeks, Granite Flats became almost peaceful. That was the dangerous part. Peace can make people believe the past has agreed to wait outside, but the past was already on its way in a canvas mailbag. The Red Cross letters arrived in late October. They came thin, creased, censored, and handled by too many strangers. Some had been written months earlier. Some carried news that was already outdated by the time it crossed the ocean. Lucia received hers after morning count. Her mother's handwriting leaned across the page as if written in a hurry under bad light. At first, the letter spoke of ordinary things: a neighbor's roof damaged by shelling, a cousin missing near Messina, flour too expensive, priests hiding records, German patrols moving through towns that had once cheered parades. Then the words changed. Her mother wrote that people were tearing down portraits of Mussolini, that men who had boasted of loyalty now claimed they had always hated him, that families were whispering about deported Jews, prison islands, beatings, informers, and things done in the name of Italy that nobody wanted to say out loud. At the bottom of the page, Lucia's mother had written one question. Did you know? Lucia read the line until the letters blurred. Did you know? Around the barracks, other women were opening their own letters. Elena learned that her older brother had joined partisans in the mountains, fighting fascists who still called themselves patriots. Mirella learned that a Jewish family, who once bought bread from her father's bakery, had disappeared from Rome before liberation came near. Teresa learned that her husband, captured in East Africa, was being questioned about crimes against civilians. Each letter was a different knife. By supper, the kitchen was full, but nobody sang. Lucia kneaded dough as if punishing it. Caleb noticed. He had learned by then that Lucia's silence had different shapes. This one was not anger, it was collapse. "What happened?" he asked quietly. Lucia did not look up. "My mother asks if I knew." "About what?" "About all of it." Caleb had no easy answer because by then the American officers had heard things too. Reports were moving through military channels. Newspaper pieces had begun naming what many people had dismissed as rumors: racial laws, political prisons, collaboration with German roundups, brutality in occupied lands, civilians treated as obstacles to empire. Captain Pike came into the kitchen that evening, carrying 3 folded newspapers. He did not hold them like a weapon. He held them like something heavy he wished belonged to someone else. "I think you should read these," he said. Elena's face hardened. "To shame us?" "No," Pike said, "because pretending not to know is part of how men like Mussolini keep winning after they lose." No one spoke after that. The women passed the newspapers around the flour-dusted table. The articles were not speeches. That made them worse. Dates, names, places, orders, camps, laws, testimony. A government's cruelty reduced to paragraphs clean enough to print. Lucia read about Jewish families stripped of rights while neighbors adjusted their curtains and carried on. She read about political prisoners sent where silence was easier to manage. She read about Ethiopia, where Italian glory had worn a gas mask. When she finished, she set the newspaper down with both hands. Her palms left flour marks on the ink. "We cooked for them," Teresa whispered. "We typed for them," Elena said. "I answered telephones," Lucia said. Her voice had gone flat. "I said the words they told me to say. I stamped papers. I carried messages. I told myself I was too small to be responsible for the machine." She looked at Caleb then. "But small parts make machines move." That line stayed in the kitchen. The pasta water boiled over. No one moved to stop it. Caleb wanted to say she had not done those things. He wanted to tell her guilt had no limits. He wanted to rescue the room the way she had rescued supper. But he had learned something from watching dough. Some things tear if you pull too hard. So he said the only honest thing he had. "Then maybe now you choose what your hands make." Lucia closed her eyes. That night, the food was nearly ruined. The sauce burned slightly. The pasta went soft. The bread came out too pale. The guards ate it anyway, not because it was good, because everyone in the room understood the meal was not about taste anymore. It was the first time the Italian women cooked after knowing what they had served before. From that night on, the kitchen changed. The laughter returned, but not as escape. It returned like work. The women began telling the truth in pieces. Who had believed, who had doubted, who had kept quiet because silence fed a family, who had liked the uniforms at first, who had thought discipline would save Italy, who had looked away when neighbors vanished. Captain Pike let those conversations happen because he knew no regulation in his drawer could produce what that kitchen was producing. Accountability, not the kind declared in a courtroom. The smaller, harder kind that starts when someone stops saying, I was only there. By November, Granite Flats was no longer a simple camp. It had become a place the nearby town talked about. A guard took home leftover bread and told his mother it had been made by an enemy prisoner who could scold a general over tomatoes. A local ranch wife sent eggs. A grocer in Amarillo sent real olive oil after hearing the army had been using cooking grease and calling it close enough. A newspaper printed a short human interest column about Italian women teaching Texas guards to make pasta in a detention camp after Italy changed sides. Captain Pike hated the attention. Then he read the column 3 times and clipped it anyway. The town did not agree on the women. Some people said prisoners should go home the minute ships were available. Some said no fascist deserved comfort. Some said women who could cook like that could not be too dangerous, which was both generous and stupid. But others began to understand the stranger truth. These women were not innocent symbols. They were not monsters either. They were people who had belonged to a country that had broken itself and harmed others while doing it. Now they had to decide what belonging meant after belief had failed. That question became urgent in January. Captain Pike received a notice. Once security cleared, Italian detainees could be returned to Allied-held ports when transport became available. The process would not be immediate, but it was coming. He expected cheers. Stedsley went still. Italy was home. Italy was also hunger, rubble, civil war, German occupation in the north, partisans in the mountains, fascist loyalists still armed, and families asking questions with no merciful answers. Elena wanted to return. "My students will be children who watched adults lie," she said. "They will need teachers who know how dangerous that is." Mirella wanted to return because her father's bakery still stood, at least according to the last letter. Teresa did not know. Lucia did not sleep for 2 nights. On the 3rd morning, Caleb found her outside the kitchen, looking toward the empty road beyond the fence. "You thinking about Sicily?" he asked. "I am thinking Sicily is inside me whether I go or not." "That sounds heavy." "It is." He leaned against the wall beside her. "My mother says land does that. You leave it and it still knows your name." Lucia smiled faintly. "Your mother sounds Italian. Don't tell her that. She'll start feeding people louder." The joke almost worked. Then Lucia said, "If I go home, I must answer for what I did not see. If I stay, I must answer for leaving when my country is bleeding." Caleb looked at the yard. "What do you want?" Lucia laughed once without humor. "What I want is to be a person who had known sooner. No one could give her that." But the town gave the women something else, a choice. Caleb's mother, Ruth Rusk, arrived at the camp in a dust-covered pickup with 2 other women and a folder full of signatures. She was a widow who ran a small ranch and did not ask permission in a voice that suggested refusal would be tiring. She told Captain Pike that several families were willing to provide housing, work guarantees, and legal support for any Italian women cleared to remain in the United States. Captain Pike blinked at her. "Mrs. Rusk, these are wartime detainees. They're also cooks," Ruth said. "That is not an immigration category. Then find one with more imagination." It took weeks. Letters went to military liaisons, immigration offices, church groups, state officials, and anyone Ruth Rusk could shame into answering. The argument was never simple. Some officials refused outright. Some warned that public sympathy could turn fast. Some wanted every woman investigated again. Captain Pike did the paperwork anyway. Not because he had forgotten what the women had been part of, because he had watched what they were becoming. By March 1944, permission came through in narrow, conditional language. A small number of Italian women at Granite Flats could apply for civilian reclassification with local guarantors, provided they passed security review and accepted supervised employment. It was not a pardon. It was not a clean slate. It was a door. 24 women chose to return to Italy when transport opened. 13 chose to stay. The farewell meal was held in the camp kitchen. No one called it a celebration. They cooked because cooking was the only language big enough for leaving. Sicilian rice balls, rough Texas beans, Roman pasta made from army flour, cornbread with olive oil, a sauce that simmered all afternoon while women packed their few belongings in silence. Guards came in off duty. Cooks stood at the walls. Captain Pike stayed near the stove, pretending to inspect nothing. Elena embraced Lucia last. "You will write," Elena said. "You will answer," Lucia said. "Send recipes. I will send mistakes." They laughed through tears. Then Elena pressed a small paper packet into Lucia's hand. Inside were dried basil seeds, saved from a garden before the war. "For your Texas dirt," Elena said. Lucia held them like relics. By summer, Lucia was living in a small room behind Ruth Rusk's house and working in a borrowed storefront in Amarillo with 2 other women from the camp. The sign in the window read, "Bellomo Kitchen." Not restaurant, not trattoria, kitchen. Because Lucia said a restaurant sold meals, but a kitchen made people accountable to one another. The first week, half the town came out of curiosity, and the other half came to judge. They found Lucia at the stove, sleeves rolled, dark hair pinned back, English still imperfect, eyes steady. Some customers wanted to be charmed. She did not perform charm. Some wanted to hear that she had always hated Mussolini. She did not give them that lie. When asked how she came to Texas, she said, "I arrived as a prisoner of a war my country helped make." Then she put bread on the table. That honesty made some people uncomfortable. It made others come back. Caleb came often. At first, he claimed he was checking whether the dough still needed protection from his hands. Then he fixed a broken shelf. Then he carried flour sacks. Then he sat after closing while Lucia wrote letters to Italy, asking Elena how to say civic responsibility in a way children could understand. They married in 1946 with no grand romance story attached to it. Just 2 people who had seen each other in a kitchen at the beginning of becoming different. Ruth Rusk grew Elena's basil seeds in coffee cans on the porch. Most died in the heat. 3 survived. Lucia treated those 3 plants like ambassadors. 23 years later, in 1967, Lucia Bellomo Rusk stood behind a lectern at a food writers' luncheon in Dallas. She was 47 now. Her hands were scarred from ovens, nicked from knives, and strong from work. Caleb sat in the front row, older and broader, smiling like the same ranch boy who had once been defeated by Doe. Their 2 children sat beside him. The oldest managed the second Bellomo kitchen location. The youngest kept trying to put too much pepper in everything and calling it innovation. The restaurant had become part of Amarillo's memory. People celebrated anniversaries there. Ranchers brought out-of-town cousins there. Former guards brought grandchildren there and pointed to the black-and-white photograph on the wall. Italian women in gray uniforms, American cooks in aprons. One embarrassed cowboy holding a torn piece of dough. Lucia spoke that day about immigrant food in America. But she did not begin with success. She began with the square of army pizza. The room laughed where it was supposed to. Then she told them about the letters, the newspapers, the question her mother had written at the bottom of the page. "Did you know?" The room stopped laughing. Lucia looked down at her hands on the lectern. "I have spent many years answering that question," she said. Some days my answer is no. Some days my answer is that I did not want to know enough. She told them food did not erase guilt. It did not repair bombed cities. It did not return deported neighbors. It did not make a uniform innocent. Food was not magic. But it could do one practical thing. It could force people to sit close enough to stop being symbols. A guard could become Caleb. A prisoner could become Lucia. An enemy could become a woman burning the sauce because a letter from home had broken her open. A country could be loved without being excused. A new life could begin without pretending the old one had been clean. Then Lucia unfolded a letter that had arrived from Rome the week before. Elena Sarti, now a teacher, had written that she used the story of the Texas kitchen with her students, not to make America heroic, not to make Italy forgiven, but to show them that history is built by ordinary hands long before it reaches official speeches. Hands that stamp papers, hands that turn away, hands that knead dough, hands that pass bread across a table to someone they were told to hate. Lucia read the final line of Elena's letter, and her voice caught only once. She wrote, "Tell them the basil grew." In the front row, Caleb lowered his head. Lucia folded the letter. For a moment she was back in Granite Flats, standing over a tray of ketchup and hot dogs, laughing because homesickness had nowhere else to go. A bad pizza had not redeemed anyone, but it had opened a door, and once that door opened, 13 women walked through it carrying flour on their hands, shame in their pockets, and basil seeds for a country that did not yet know their names.